As I was preparing the message this week, I was reminded of the importance of seeing everything as a whole and how everything is connected. And I was reminded of a story from growing up. And I grew up in a smaller town in the Midwest. And there was one of these town characters, and you know them a lot. We just called him Jonesy. And Jonesy was a smart enough guy, but he didn't have a lot of ambition, if you know what I mean. And so he earned a living, but just enough to get by. And when he'd saved enough money, he bought him a moped. You know what I'm talking about? One of those tiny little motorcycle like that. And he would go around the town on his motorcycle, just revving it up, and everything. And one day in particular, Jonesy was going around town, and he pulled up at a stoplight, and he was revving his little engine. And just about that time, a man in a Porsche pulled up beside him. And the man looked over at Jonesy and kind of chuckled, and then he revved his engine of his Porsche. And Jonesy looked over at him and he revved the engine of the moped. The guy in the Porsche looked over and he revved the engine of the Porsche. And one more time, and the light changed, and they just both took off as fast as they could. And of course, as you may well realize, the Porsche is just taking off and leaving poor Jonesy way, way behind. And the man in the Porsche is kind of chuckling, and he looks in his mirror, and all of a sudden, here comes Jonesy. And he's gaining on the Porsche. And no matter what the guy does, and all of a sudden, not only does he gain on him, but he zooms past him. And then when he gets out there about 100 yards, he not only does that, he turns around and comes right back past the Porsche. And Jonesy's got this look on his face, as he's going by the Porsche. And he gets down behind the Porsche again, about 100 yards, turns around, and here he comes again. And by that time, the guy in the Porsche is just flooring it, just as fast as he can go, and here comes Jonesy. But this time, Jonesy just lost a little bit of control right at the end, and he smashed into the back of the Porsche. Oh man, the guy was a little nervous and a little worried, and he stopped the car, and he got out, and Jonesy was laying there kind of crumpled up and looked a little beaten and bloody, but he says, "Are you all right?" And Jonesy says, "Yeah." The man says, "Well, is there anything at all I can do for you?" And Jonesy looked at him and he said, "Well, yeah, could you unhook my suspenders from your rearview mirror?" See the big picture. The whole system is important to see. We have to know every inch of everything that's happening, don't we? And that's what's important. And if we want to be a systems thinker, whether we're leading in the church, at home, at work, there are some core competencies that are extremely important. There's 3 of them, and we're going to share those with you. The first is you need to be comfortable with complexity. Because when you see everything as a system, we know things are often complex, don't we? Jonesy found that out. It's not just a moped and a Porsche, it's everything that connects them. So that's complex thinking. We need to demonstrate adaptability. One thing a person that sees the big picture knows is that things don't always go exactly as you plan. And so how do I change things on the run and keep going in the direction I need to go? And the third piece of being a systems thinker as a servant leader is to consider the greater good. It's not just about this one person, it's just not about this one event or one moment. It's about what's good in the big picture for all that are involved. And when we think like that, we look at things, and there really are 4 layers of them, and I'm not going to spend any time on this, only to mention them to you. The first thing we notice in anything that's happening is the event, what's happening, and then sometimes we look at the strategies below that makes the event happen, and below those strategies is a culture from which we set those strategies, and even further below is our belief system. So you can see when you're going to make changes, you can't just change the events. You really can't even just change the strategies, but you have to dig down and understand the culture of what you're dealing with and understand those core beliefs that lie under that. And so those are very, very important things. And so just wanted to mention those today because we're going to go back and take a deeper look at being comfortable with complexity. And we're going to begin by looking at a couple scriptures. I think that's always very important when we can. And all of my scriptures today are from Jesus. They're stories of Jesus. Today we started with this great story of the wheat and the weeds, didn't we? Now, for most of us, for the servants, they saw a problem. There was weeds in the wheat. Their solution was pull up the weeds. But Jesus saw the complex nature of that. And he said, if we pull up those weeds, we're going to lose some wheat too. So the important thing is not to do it that way. Jesus could see this big picture of how complex it was. Another time that Jesus did that, and we often know that in the scriptures, people are always trying to trick Jesus into making a mistake. And there was a time that Jesus talked about giving everything to God and what was God's. And someone brought him a coin, and the coin had the picture of Caesar on it. And so they knew they kind of had him in a bind, and they said, oh, well, what are we supposed to do about paying taxes to Caesar? And Jesus looked at him and he said, well, the coin's Caesar's, so you give to Caesar what's Caesar's, and you give to God what's God's. And Jesus knew our lives were what needed to be given to God. So once again, he understood the complexity, tried to be tricked, but could see the big picture. And the final one I just want to mention briefly is when he stood in his last days before Pilate. And Pilate asked him if he was a king. And he said, my kingdom isn't of this world. You don't even have a clue. You don't understand the big picture of all that's happening here. So we see those things as they come together. One of the things we learn when we think of things that are complex is that everything is related and everything is part of a system. I mentioned this in the first service. When I first moved here about 5 years ago, one of the first people I met were Lloyd and Dorothy Byers. Lloyd passed away a couple of weeks ago. I did his service yesterday, and they'd been married 74 and a half years. And one of the things that they both told me was, almost immediately, oh, we were married in your hometown. Here they were married in a town in the Midwest, a small town, many, many years ago, and we end up here together. All things indeed are connected. There are connections for everything. One of the things when you understand complexity is, as a leader, you have to understand you may not have all the answers. It's kind of funny when we think about that. We think about, I didn't say this earlier, but in relation to our own political system, we continually expect every new leader that just by being new that you're going to have the answers to all the questions. And the truth is most of us don't. I mean, I've often expected to have all the answers at church and what we're doing and where we're headed. But you see, it's not important to have all the answers. It is important to be comfortable with living into the questions as we move towards the vision. If you have God's vision, you know where you're going, you don't always have to have all the answers. The next core competency is this idea that you need to demonstrate adaptability. You need to be willing to make a change when it has to be made. And I was thinking of the stories of Jesus again. One of my favorites in this would be a story we call the miracle on the way to the miracle. Jesus was going to perform a miracle, and a woman reached out and touched the hem of his garment, and he stopped, and he said, oh, because of your faith, you're healed. Jesus adapted. He ended up making both miracles, but he adapted because he saw the need to stop and do something right then. Don't we often do that with our children? We have an idea of where we're going, and all of a sudden we need to make a change, and we need to adapt to the current situation. Another time, Jesus was in the boat, and he said, I want to take a nap for a while. Just take a nap, let me nap. And of course, the seas get really rough and rugged, and the disciples get frightened and scared. And instead of continuing to nap, Jesus says, okay, I'll change my plans and get up, and he calms the sea. Anyone here ever been interrupted in a nap? Anyone here ever have little children? You understand what I'm saying. We don't always get to do what we want. We have to be flexible. We have to be ready to change. And the last one I was thinking about was the story of Lazarus. Lazarus was Jesus' dear friend, but when he found out that he was sick, he couldn't get there in time. And so he adapted and he did what he needed to do. And then when he came, Lazarus had already died. But Jesus said, okay, no problem for me. He said, I'm going to adapt to the situation. And he made his greatest healing of all time with Lazarus. And so we see these stories over and over again. And I want to say something to you. The art of progress, of moving forward, is to preserve order amid change, while at the same time preserving change amid order. You see, change is we're going to move forward with change. We have to learn how to make these mid-course corrections. And I've discovered over the years in ministry that most people in churches will allow you to make mid-course corrections as long as they understand the vision at the end of the tunnel, where we're headed. Okay, we're going to have to go around this rock. We're going to have to get there a little differently than we anticipated. Those of us working with the Coffee House Ministry right now, we are making a lot of mid-course corrections as we go, and we're doing what we need to do along the path. Adaptability is a natural process. We see it in nature, don't we? We see it in the animal kingdom. We see it in the plant kingdom. It's also true for us as humans. It's in harmony with nature's process. Rigid stubbornness is what's unnatural. And that's what gets in our way. And I'm going to say something to you right now that I think is, if you take nothing else with you in the sermon today, remember these words that are going on the screen right now. Change is inevitable. Growth is optional. Change is going to happen whether we want it to or not. You're not the same person that you were when you walked in here today. Your body cells have changed. Your breathing has changed. And you have changed. Now, whether you're growing or not is up to you. That is totally optional for you. So I was reminded of a couple of little kind of humorous little things, and you may know the answers to these, but I'm going to ask you anyway. Do you know how many psychologists it takes to change a light bulb? Well, the answer is one, but the light bulb really has to want to change. Now, how many United Methodists does it take to change a light bulb? Well, it's 5. It's 1 to actually change the bulb, and 4 to talk about how great the old bulb was. It's kind of how we get stuck, isn't it? We get stuck and we get stuck, and so it's a good thing to remember that we're going to change, and change is going to happen. And I just wanted to hit these for you very, very briefly today. In the face of change, we can't stop it, but we can control our reactions to the change, and that's how we grow. There are 3 kinds of change that I'm going to hit very, very briefly, and one of those is at the organizational level, the church. Things change. That's the way it is. New pastors come in, old pastors leave, different musicians come in, different people come in. Change happens in the organization. It also happens for us in relationships. I mean, think about your relationship if you're in my age range, to my children when they were this age, and now to my children now that they're this age. It's a totally different relationship. Even your friendships in the church. Some people you thought when you came, perhaps, might be your closest friend, but you may have met somebody else and all of a sudden, oh, wow. And so relationships change. And also then individually we change. We are called to grow and be different people continually. That's why we're doing this sermon series, because each of us, in our own way, is called to grow and change as we become the person of faith that God has called us to be. The final core competency is this. We need to consider the greater good. If anybody was better at that than Jesus, I don't know. I thought of the story of the feeding of the 5,000. To start with, in that story, you may or may not remember, Jesus wanted to get away. He needed some rest, but the crowds followed him. And then it became late and there was no food, and so the disciples said, let us send them away back to town so they can get their own food. But Jesus saw the big picture, the greater good that needed to be had, and so he said, no, let's feed them. And they did. Another story that Jesus did was when he was praying shortly before he went to the cross for us. He prayed to God and he said, God, I really don't want to do this. He said, in fact, if at all possible, take this cup from me. Don't make me go down this road. But when God responded that Jesus needed to stay the course, he did, because he knew it wasn't about his life. It was about all of us. And finally, even when Jesus was resurrected, and in the book of John, he's walking along the shore, he's with the disciples, and he says to Peter, he says, Peter, you know what you need to do? You need to feed my sheep. Even in Jesus' last moments on earth with his disciples, he was looking at the greater good, and he was encouraging them on the path for greater good. A servant leader always does this. They extend their thinking to include the greater good. It's more than just about them. It's about their actions. It's about their family. It's about individual people. It's others. It's about the community. And all of those things matter. I want to finish today by sharing with you from one of my favorite poets, priests, writers from hundreds of years ago. And I've shared parts of his message before, but I wanted to share the story with you today. And it's a man named John Donne. And John Donne was an Anglican priest, and he was lived during the Black Plague. And there was something that happened during the Black Plague. When people in this city would die, the village would die, the church would ring their bells to let people know that someone was lost, and so they could pray. And John got very, very, very ill. He thought he had the plague. He was with a fever for days. And he was so sick that when the fever finally broke and he woke up, the first thing he heard were the tolling of the bells of the church. And John Donne was certain in that first moment that he had died and the bells were ringing for him. And after he figured out he was still alive, he realized his connection to all of humanity. And he sat down and he penned something that Ernest Hemingway later borrowed in the title of a book. And the saying is, "For whom the bell tolls." And John Donne wrote, because of our connection to each other in this great system of life, that don't ever send to find out for whom the bell's tolling. No, because of our connection to one another, it's tolling for thee, John Donne said. Because we are diminished by the death of anyone, and Donne said that. And he said these famous words, "No man is an island unto himself. Each of us is a part of the whole. Therefore send not for whom the bell tolls, it tolls for thee." So today I want to leave you with that thought of connection, of community, of our call to think of the big picture and look at the greater good, because we are connected to one another in so many ways. And now we're called to be a community of faith who leads from a servant leadership, who continues to share the gospel and the love of God with the world. Thanks be to God. Amen.